April 15th, 1931. A Wednesday afternoon at Nuova Villa Tammaro restaurant in Coney Island is shattered by gunfire. 20 shots echo through the dining room. By the time the smoke cleared, Giuseppe, Joe the boss Masseria, lay dead on the checkered tablecloth, face down in a pool of blood, cards scattered around him. The New York Times headline the next morning called it, "Another Gangland Execution." Police Commissioner Edward Mulrooney dispatched 40 detectives to the scene. They found nothing but silence. No witnesses, no suspects, just the usual gang silence that protected killers. But this wasn't just another murder. The newspapers didn't know it yet, but they were reporting on the death of the old Mafia and the birth of something far more dangerous. A corporate empire built on blood and silence that would survive for the next 100 years. Because the man who walked away from that restaurant that afternoon wasn't just a killer. Charles "Lucky" Luciano was a 34-year-old visionary from Sicily's poorest town who understood something the old bosses never could. Chaos was bad for business. While Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano fought a war that killed 60 men over who controlled the rackets, Luciano saw millions of dollars walking out the door. Bootlegging profits going to the Irish, gambling operations controlled by Jews, all because the Mustache Petes refused to work with anyone who wasn't from the right village in Sicily. Luciano had a different vision, a national crime syndicate, a commission that would govern all mafia activities. 5 families with equal power, preventing the blood feuds that made headlines and attracted federal attention. But first, he had to kill his way to the top. This is the story of how one news article, one murder, changed everything. How a street gangster from Manhattan's Lower East Side transformed America's underworld from warring fiefdoms into the most powerful criminal organization the world had ever seen. This is the Genovese crime family. To understand why April 15th, 1931 changed everything, you need to understand the war that came before it. The Castellamarese War, named after a small fishing village in Sicily called Castellammare del Golfo. A war so bloody it killed over 60 men in just 14 months. On one side, Giuseppe Joe the boss Masseria, born in Sicily in 1886, arrived in New York in 1902. By 1920, he controlled the most important mafia operations in the United States: bootlegging, extortion, gambling, labor racketeering. He was called the man who can dodge bullets after surviving multiple assassination attempts, once with 2 bullet holes through his straw hat while he sat on his bed, still wearing it. Masseria had built his empire the old way, through fear, through tribute, through forcing other gangs to pay him homage. In 1928, when he wanted to consolidate power, he had his rival Salvatore d'Aquila, the so-called boss of bosses, shot dead on Avenue A in Manhattan. On the other side, Salvatore Maranzano, educated, spoke Latin and Greek, obsessed with Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire. He arrived in the United States around 1925, already a formidable presence in the Sicilian Mafia. He organized his gang like a Roman legion, with clear hierarchy and military discipline. But the real problem wasn't these 2 men. The problem was their philosophy. They were Mustache Petes, old-world Sicilians who refused to adapt to America. They wouldn't work with non-Italians, even though the biggest bootlegging profits were being made by Jewish and Irish gangs. They wouldn't share territory. They demanded tribute from other families, breeding resentment. They believed in the old ways, where a boss ruled through fear, and everyone from your village back in Sicily was family, and everyone else was an enemy. While Masseria and Maranzano fought over Brooklyn bakeries and Bronx gambling dens, the modern gangsters saw fortunes being made. Meyer Lansky, a Polish-Jewish immigrant who arrived in New York in 1911. brilliant mathematical mind. Calm, calculated. Never carried a gun after 1918. He saw organized crime as a business that needed proper accounting and investment. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Lansky's childhood friend. Handsome, charismatic, and absolutely ruthless. He loved violence in a way that even scared other gangsters. One detective said Siegel seemed to like to do the job himself. He got his kicks out of seeing his victims suffering, groaning, and dying. Together, they formed the Bugs and Meyer mob in the early 1920s. They hired out as muscle, ran bootlegging operations, and made a reputation as the most violent gang in New York. And they were Lucky Luciano's closest allies. The story goes that Luciano and Lansky met as teenagers when Luciano tried to shake down Lansky for protection money. Instead of paying, the young Lansky fought back. Luciano was so impressed by his courage that they became partners instead. This was the new generation. Italians, Jews, Irish. They didn't care about what village you came from in Sicily. They cared about money, and they knew that the Castellamarese War was destroying profit margins. February 26, 1930, the first shots were fired. The war would rage for 14 months. Giuseppe Morello, Masseria's war chief and strategic advisor, was gunned down in his East Harlem office in August 1930 while collecting cash receipts. Gaetano Reyna, a Bronx boss, was shot dead in February 1931. Giuseppe Pinsolo was murdered in a Times Square office. Bodies piled up on both sides. Masseria was losing. His men were defecting to Maranzano. His empire was crumbling. And Lucky Luciano saw his opportunity. In early 1931, Luciano opened secret negotiations with Maranzano. The deal was simple. Luciano would betray his boss, Joe Masseria, in exchange for taking over Masseria's rackets and becoming Maranzano's second-in-command. Maranzano agreed, but when Masseria found out about the betrayal, he approached Joe Adonis, one of Luciano's associates, and asked him to kill Luciano. Adonis warned Luciano instead. Now Luciano knew he had to act fast. The date was set, April 15, 1931. The restaurant was owned by Gerardo Scarpato, a known mob associate. Masseria loved eating there. He felt safe there. It was one of his favorite spots. April 15, 1931, a Wednesday. While King Alfonso and Queen Ana of Spain went into exile that same day, and the Brooklyn Robins lost to the Boston Braves, Lucky Luciano made his play for power. According to newspaper reports, Masseria arrived at the restaurant in his armored steel car shortly before 3:09 p.m. He came with companions. Some reports said Luciano was with him. Others mentioned 2 or 3 unknown men. They ordered a simple meal: bread, wine, coffee. Then they settled in for a game of cards. Pinochle. Masseria loved cards. Around 3 p.m., according to legend, Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. That's when the gunmen entered. 4 men. Some sources identify them as Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. All future heavyweight names in the Mafia. All young, ambitious, and loyal to Luciano. They walked in without hurry, well-dressed, calm, professional, and they opened fire. 20 shots were fired. Masseria, the man who could dodge bullets, couldn't dodge these. 4 bullets struck his back. One hit him in the back of the head. He slumped forward onto the checkered tablecloth, dead before he hit the table. His autopsy report would later show he died on an empty stomach. The meal had barely been touched. The gunmen walked out just as calmly as they entered. No rush, no panic. They got into a waiting car and drove away. Cairo, the artichoke king Terranova, was supposedly behind the wheel, but legend has it he was so shaken he couldn't drive, and Siegel had to shove him out of the driver's seat. The New York Times, April 16, 1931. Police mystified in slaying of boss. Most usual gang silence, as 40 detectives seek clues to killer of racket chief. The New York Herald Tribune reported that 2 well-dressed young men drove up, strolled leisurely into the restaurant, and the shooting began immediately. Then they came out without any visible signs of haste, entered their automobile, and drove away. Police found 2 revolvers in an alley next to the restaurant, .32 and .38 caliber. They recovered hats and overcoats left behind by the killers. Some bore Chicago labels, leading investigators to theorize a connection to Al Capone. But there were no witnesses. Not one person came forward. Not the owner. Not Scarpato's mother-in-law, Anna Tammaro, who was in the restaurant at the time. Not Luciano, who claimed he was in the bathroom and didn't see anything. 40 detectives found nothing. Luciano was brought in for questioning. He had an alibi. He was released. The case was never solved. The headlines called it another mob execution. Joe Masseria, bigger than Al Capone, gunned down in broad daylight. The police called it the usual gang silence. But for those who understood what was happening, this was the end of an era. The Castellamarese war was over. Maranzano had won. Or so he thought. With Masseria dead, Salvatore Maranzano called a meeting of crime bosses from around the country in Wappingers Falls, New York. He reorganized the Italian-American gangs in New York into what would become the 5 families. The Luciano family, led by Lucky Luciano. The Profaci family, led by Joseph Profaci. The Mangano family, led by Vincent Mangano. The Galliano family, led by Tommy Galliano. And his own family, which would later become the Bonanno family. Each family had its structure: boss, underboss, consigliere, capos, soldiers, and associates. A clear hierarchy modeled after the Roman legions Maranzano admired. And then Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti I capi, boss of all bosses. Every family would pay him tribute. Every major decision would go through him. He was the supreme authority of the American Mafia. It was exactly the kind of power grab that Luciano had been planning to eliminate. Maranzano ruled for exactly 4 months and 26 days. By September, Maranzano realized Luciano was a threat. He hired Vincent Mad Dog Call, an Irish gangster and one of the most feared killers in New York, to murder Luciano and Vito Genovese. But Tommy Lucchese, one of Maranzano's own men, alerted Luciano that he was marked for death. Luciano decided to strike first, September 10, 1931. Around 2 p.m., Maranzano had moved his offices to the 9th floor of the New York Central Building, one of the most prestigious addresses in Manhattan. He operated under the front of the Eagle Building Corporation, overseeing his empire that included speakeasies, illegal gambling operations, and a $20 million a year immigrant smuggling network. Luciano sent 4 men to Maranzano's office, Jewish gangsters whose faces were unknown to Maranzano's people. They were secured with the help of Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. The 4 men walked into the waiting room. They flashed detective badges. "We're the police," they announced. They lined up everyone in the office against the wall. Then they stormed into Maranzano's private office. Maranzano fought back. He threw punches, knocked fedoras off the gunmen's heads. But they overpowered him. They stabbed him 6 times. Then they shot him 5 times. As the gunmen fled down the stairs, they bumped into Vincent Mad Dog Call, who was on his way up to the office for his meeting with Maranzano about killing Luciano. The assassins ditched their weapons and disappeared into the crowds of Midtown Manhattan. Salvatore Maranzano was dead, killed in his own office in broad daylight in one of Manhattan's finest buildings. Police theories swirled. Some pointed to an alien smuggling racket, others to narcotics. Some thought it was connected to Al Capone because the killer's hats bore Chicago labels. But Luciano had covered his tracks well. In the span of 5 months, Lucky Luciano had orchestrated the murders of the two most powerful mafia bosses in America: Joe Masseria on April 15th, Salvatore Maranzano on September 10th. The old world was dead, and now Luciano would build something new. After Maranzano's murder, Luciano called a meeting, not in New York, but in Chicago. Neutral territory. He invited the most powerful crime bosses in the country. He could have declared himself capo di tutti I capi, boss of bosses. No one would have objected. He'd proven himself ruthless enough, smart enough, powerful enough. But Luciano did something revolutionary. He abolished the title. Luciano understood what Masseria and Maranzano never did. The title of boss of bosses created trouble between families. It made you a target. It bred resentment. It caused wars. And wars were bad for business. Instead, Luciano proposed something modeled after corporate America: a board of directors. The commission would consist of 7 family bosses. From New York's 5 families: Charlie Lucky Luciano, the Luciano family, later renamed Genovese; Joseph Bonanno, the Maranzano family, later renamed Bonanno; Joe Profaci, the Profaci family, later renamed Colombo; Vincent Mangano, the Mangano family, later renamed Gambino; Tommy Galliano, the Galliano family, later renamed Lucchese, from outside New York; Al Capone, representing the Chicago outfit and everything in the western United States; Stefano Magaddino, representing the Buffalo family. Luciano would serve as chairman. Not boss. Chairman. The commission would meet every 5 years, or whenever needed, to discuss family problems. They would oversee all mafia activities in the United States. They would mediate conflicts between families. They would approve all new bosses before they could officially take power. The 5 families in New York agreed that the names of all new proposed members must be approved by the other families before anyone could become a made man. Most importantly, the commission had the power to authorize hits on other made men, but only after a vote. This prevented random violence that attracted attention. Luciano also did something else revolutionary. He allowed Jewish mobsters to work alongside the commission. Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Louis Lepke Buchhalter, Dutch Schultz, and Abner Longy Swillman were given positions of power and included in some commission meetings. Associates could come from any background. Only made men had to be full-blooded Italian Americans in most eras. This was the vision Meyer Lansky had articulated years earlier. The Yides and the Dagos will no longer fight each other. To handle enforcement, Luciano and Lansky created a special outfit. The press would later call it Murder in Contour. Headed by Louis Lepke Buchhalter and Albert Mad Hatter. Anastasia, this was a professional squad of killers who carried out hits authorized by the commission. This kept individual families' hands clean. It prevented blood feuds. It was organized crime in the truest sense. The commission's first real test came in 1935. Dutch Schultz, a powerful New York gangster, wanted to murder Thomas Dewey, the special prosecutor who would later become governor of New York. Schultz argued that Dewey was putting too much pressure on the families. Killing him would send a message. The commission voted against it. They believed murdering a prosecutor would bring too much heat from law enforcement. It would be bad for business. Schultz questioned the authority of the commission, so the commission authorized his murder. Murder in Contour handled it. On October 23, 1935, Schultz was gunned down in a Newark restaurant. The message was clear. The commission's authority was absolute. The family that Lucky Luciano founded would become the most powerful and the most secretive of the 5 families. It would survive leadership changes, federal prosecutions, and wars with other families to remain the dominant force in American organized crime for nearly a century. They called it the silent superpower. In 1936, prosecutor Thomas Dewey convicted Luciano on compulsory prostitution charges. It was a dubious case, likely built on questionable evidence, but it worked. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. From prison, Luciano remained chairman of the commission. His underboss, Vito Genovese, became acting boss. But in 1937, Genovese fled to Italy to avoid a murder charge. Frank. The Prime Minister Costello took over as acting boss. Born Francesco Castiglia in Calabria, Italy, Costello was the opposite of the violent gangsters who had come before. He was diplomatic, politically connected, smooth. Costello didn't believe in violence unless absolutely necessary. He believed in corruption. He maintained relationships with judges, politicians, district attorneys, and city officials. He once said, "I treat them good." That's how he kept power. Under Costello, the Luciano family expanded operations into gambling in Florida, Cuba, and Las Vegas. He made deals with Governor Huey Long in Louisiana to place slot machines throughout the state. He invested in nightclubs and casinos. He turned the family into a legitimate-looking operation while maintaining its criminal core. Costello ruled for 20 years. 20 peaceful, profitable years. In 1946, after helping the U.S. government during World War II through Operation Underworld, securing the New York waterfront against German sabotage, Luciano's sentence was commuted. He was deported to Italy. He would never return to the United States, but he would continue to exert influence over the commission from abroad until his death in 1962. Vito Genovese returned to the United States in 1945 after World War II. He'd spent the war years in Italy, first supporting Mussolini, then switching sides to help the Allies when Italy's defeat became evident. Back in New York, Genovese wanted what he believed was rightfully his: control of the family. The only person standing in his way was Frank Costello. On May 2, 1957, Genovese sent his soldier, Vincent the Chin Gigante, to murder Costello. As Costello returned to his apartment building on Central Park West, Gigante approached from behind. "This is for you, Frank," Gigante said. He fired one shot. The bullet grazed Costello's skull, leaving only a superficial wound. Costello survived. True to the Mafia code of omertà, Costello refused to identify his attacker in court. Gigante was acquitted, but the message was clear. Costello stepped aside and retired. Genovese became the official boss of the family. For the first time since Lucky Luciano founded it in 1931, the family would be renamed. It became the Genovese crime family. Genovese's reign was short and disastrous. In 1957, he organized the infamous Appalachian meeting in upstate New York, trying to consolidate his power as chairman of the commission. Police raided the meeting, arresting over 60 mobsters. It was a public relations disaster that exposed the Mafia's existence to the American public. In 1959, Genovese was convicted of conspiracy to violate narcotics laws. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, where he died in 1969 of a heart attack. But even from prison, Genovese maintained control through front bosses and acting bosses. The family continued to operate. The family's most notorious boss came decades later. Vincent the Chin Gigante, the same man who shot Frank Costello in 1957, took actual control of the family in 1981. Gigante perfected the art of the silent superpower. For years, he feigned insanity to avoid prosecution. He would wander around Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and pajamas, unshaven, muttering to himself incoherently. Prosecutors called him the Odd Father. But it was an act. Behind the scenes, Gigante was running the most powerful crime family in America. The FBI later revealed that the Genovese family had been keeping up this ruse since 1969. using front bosses, while the real power operated in shadows. In 1997, Gigante was finally convicted of racketeering and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Even then, he maintained the Insanity Act. He died in prison in 2005. What made the Genovese family the silent superpower wasn't just violence. It was discipline. It was intelligence operations. It was the willingness to operate in the shadows while other families grabbed headlines. The Genovese family pioneered the use of front bosses to protect the real leadership. They invested heavily in intelligence, knowing who was under surveillance, who was cooperating with the feds, who could be trusted. They avoided the flashy lifestyle that brought down other bosses. No media attention, no celebrity, just business. This approach, pioneered by Lucky Luciano and refined by his successors, allowed the family to survive when others crumbled. While the Gambino family suffered public trials in the 1980s and 1990s, while the Colombo family descended into civil war, while the Bonanno family had its charter temporarily revoked by the Commission, the Genovese family remained stable. The commission that Lucky Luciano established in 1931 still exists today, though its power has diminished significantly. The last known major commission meeting was in 1985, captured on FBI surveillance during the Mafia commission trial that convicted the bosses of the 5 families. But the structure remains. The 5 families still operate in New York. The Genovese family is still considered the most powerful and the most secretive. What made 1931 so significant wasn't just the murders. It was the revolution in how organized crime operated in America. Before Luciano, the Mafia was a collection of street gangs fighting over territory, demanding tribute, killing each other over insults and old-world grudges. After Luciano, it was a corporation, a national crime syndicate with rules, structure, and a governing body that prevented wars and maximized profits. The commission allowed disputes to be settled through negotiation instead of violence. It created a system where families could coexist, share territories, and cooperate on larger operations. This structure allowed the Mafia to survive for the next 100 years. Through prohibition, through the heroin trade of the 1950s and 60s, through the federal crackdowns of the 1980s and 90s, through RICO prosecutions and witness cooperation programs, the Mafia adapted because Lucky Luciano had given it a framework that could adapt. We return to where we began, that newspaper headline from April 16, 1931. Racket chief, slain by gangster gunfire. The police called it unsolved. 40 detectives found nothing. The usual gang silence protected the killers. But that silence was more than just omerta. It was the first demonstration of Luciano's new order, a hit so well coordinated, so professionally executed, that even with 40 detectives, the police couldn't find a single witness. That silence would become the hallmark of the Genovese family. The silent superpower. Lucky Luciano, 1931-1946. The founder, the visionary, the man who turned street gangs into a corporation. Frank Costello, 1946-1957. The prime minister, the diplomat who maintained power through corruption instead of violence. Vito Genovese, 1957-1969. The ambitious killer who gave the family its name, even as he destroyed much of what Costello built. Vincent Gigante, 1981-2005. The Oddfather. The master of deception who proved that the best way to survive in organized crime was to avoid attention altogether. The headlines called it a murder. History calls it the birth of an empire. On April 15, 1931, in a small restaurant in Coney Island, the old world of the Mafia died with Joe Masseria. And in its place, Lucky Luciano built the most powerful criminal organization in American history. An organization that would bear many names. the Luciano family, the Genovese family, the Commission, the silent superpower. But it all started with one news article, one murder. One man who understood that in the underworld, as in the legitimate world, structure beats chaos, organization beats violence, and silence beats publicity. This is the Genovese crime family.